Hello, thanks for clicking on this. Today I'm going to start possibly one of the sketchiest things I've ever done to a car. I'm going to be deleting the spare wheel well from the CRX as part of the turbo and all-wheel drive build. I haven't just seen this done to a CRX. Maybe somebody's done it. I've seen it done to other cars. The goal here is going to be to cut out this whole well down here and put in a big aluminum plate over the whole thing. The reasons for this to get rid of that is, well, one, I'm not going to need it because the whole fuel cell and surge tank setup is going to go here to support the turbo system. And I want more room down here. Here's my end of my exhaust. I want to put a muffler here. This is in the way. Eventually the gas tank's going to have to go too for the rear diff and all the all-wheel drive bits. Maybe I want diffusers in here. Either way, this is useless and taking up space. Okay, let's do this. The new raised floor is going to be made out of this aluminum plate that is 2.7 millimeters thick. And that's really the only thing we're going to add to this car. The first step, before I do anything permanent and crazy like cutting the car, is I'm going to remove all these plastics and use a big piece of cardboard, courtesy of Walmart, to kind of cut out the shape of what the aluminum plate needs to be. And then I can get everything fitted and make sure that it's going to work the way I think it will before I actually start cutting the car. So I did some CAD, some cardboard aided design, and I have cut the box out to capture the shape of the trunk for the next steps. This aluminum piece isn't quite big enough, or at least not quite as wide as the trunk, but it will be big enough for this project, so I'm going to go ahead and start cutting this out. I'm using a cutoff wheel to cut the straight lines, and don't worry, I've got safety socks on, and then I'll switch over to the plasma cutter to cut the curved lines. I could definitely do this with just a cutoff wheel or an angle grinder, but if you have a plasma cutter, you kind of always want to use a plasma cutter. Just test fit this in the trunk of the CRX and it fit. I use an angle grinder to clean up these edges right here. Now I am ready to sand it off and spray the whole thing with bed liner. I've delayed the inevitable as long as I can. Now I actually have to start cutting this. So I'm using a 5-inch metal cutting wheel, and I did not just YOLO start cutting this. I did measure and mark with a Sharpie very carefully to make sure that I have a straight line all the way around. My plan here is to remove, or rather raise, the floor by like 3.5 inches. Now the trunk of the CRX is kind of funny because part of this here in the middle is going to actually be connected to the cross member that kind of joins the left and right knuckles. So what I can't do is just cut the whole middle out. There's actually going to be a bar going across that we'll see that I'll have to deal with, and then I'll have to patch over that with more metal. Before I can cut the back out, I have to get this gas tank out of the way. It's physically in the way, and I just don't want to shoot a bunch of sparks all over the gas tank. So I'm going to remove these bolts, I'm going to drop it down, and it's not going back in anyways because we're going to a fuel cell system. I've removed other stuff we're not going to need anymore, like the fuel filler neck, and then of course dragging that whole tank out of here, so we're saving weight too. So I don't know if this is a COVID thing or what, but it was pretty hard to find any flat steel that was thick enough to actually replace the floor of the trunk. So I'm going to reuse the trunk. So I do need to smash it flat so that I can weld it back up in there about, like I said, 3.5 inch higher than the trunk originally was. I have the now hammered flat section of the trunk held up in here on a jack, and now I'm cleaning up the metal so I can weld it back in. tacked up the rear section, you can see that I had to leave in the part that's actually connected to the cross member, and you can see the gap that it leaves in the back. That's where I'll have to fabricate my own floor. Many hours later, the old trunk is welded back in, the new metal is welded in, really ugly, and I'm going to clean this all up and seam seal the whole dang thing. I put seam sealer everywhere that I had welded. I've never used this stuff before, so maybe I used way too much. You can tell me in the comments, but it's sealed. And now I've primed the seam sealer, I primed all of the bare metal and where the paint had worn through. Lastly, I'm going to paint everything that I primed and around it just so that it all matches with this nice rust-proof paint. So yeah, that probably was more seam sealer than I needed, but it's sealed, it's painted, it's rust-proof. This will work. Let's put the top down. Here's the aluminum plate that was previously bed linered. It fits just fine, so we're going to drill some holes in it, and then we're going to pull it up and put some rib nuts down. And then before I put the whole thing down and secure it, we're going to put foam tape everywhere on the bottom where there could possibly be contact, so this addition doesn't become a new source of horrible Honda rattle. Another thing I want to do before I secure the plate is use this door trim. It's rubber, and I can put it over all these sharp edges, and it looks a lot nicer and feels a lot nicer too. I'm a big fan of these little Amazon kits with all the washers and nuts and screws so that I always have exactly the right parts. It saves a lot of trips to the hardware store when you're in the middle of a project, and it makes things look a little nicer when you're all put together. Alright, we're nearly done. The plate is bolted down into the rib nuts. If you've never used rivet nuts before, definitely look them up because they are huge time savers and super useful. I do have to, of course, take this plate out and put the plastics in and really test fit it. Before this would actually fit in here with the plastic, I had to cut off more of the sides with the plasma cutter, but it all finally fit, and I can go ahead and move on to the fuel system, which is really the whole point of this. So, like a lot of my ideas, that was way more work than I expected it to be, but I now have a totally flat, clean surface to mount my fuel system on, and I am future-proof. When I get to the all-wheel drive system, I will be able to put the differential in and not have any problems and not have to take apart my fuel system and cut out more stuff. So stay tuned for the fuel system and the all-wheel drive and the turbo and everything else.